Hey guys, so welcome to chapter 17, the final challenge, death and dying. So this is the psychology of death, how we deal with death, the traditions of death like funerals, as well as the actual process of dying. So first, let's define what death is. So the Harvard definition of death is the one that's most commonly used, and this is total brain death, meaning that the body might still be alive, but the brain is not alive. So this definition says that the body is unresponsive to stimuli, so if you poke the person or shook them, they're not going to respond. No movement or breathing, okay? So, and this is for a certain period of time, so failure to move for an hour, and then not breathing for 3 minutes. Okay. So after 3 minutes, they can call it. Although, we'll talk a little bit about how controversial this is, because there are people who have not breathed for longer than 3 minutes, and they have been brought back from that. There's been people, there's a woman a few years ago who was, I think she got in a car accident or something in the middle of a blizzard in Montana, and she froze solid, literally froze solid, so that when this person found her, he had to try to get her into his car with, like, I don't know, a Tetris game, because he couldn't bend anything. She was literally frozen solid, and when he took her to the hospital and they defrosted her, and she lived through it. So what death is kind of complicated. So anyhow, unresponsive to stimuli, no movement or breathing, no reflexes, and then the EEG, the electroencephalogram, is flat. So there's no activity in the brain that can be measured. And then they usually will, depending on the situation, repeat the process after 24 hours just to make sure. But if you are an organ donor or something like that, then obviously they move pretty quickly with that. So there have been cases where people have gone into a coma where they have been totally brain dead, even when they stop breathing, or they can't breathe without life support, that they come back and they function normally without any problems. And on the other hand, there are people who their body is functioning fine on life support, but the brain is totally dead. And, is that alive? Does that person have rights? I mean, what do you do with somebody in that stage such as Terry Schiavo? You remember that case back in 2005? She had been in this vegetative state. She'd been brain dead. Sorry, I have a cold. For like 10 years. And her husband decided, and her parents decided, that they weren't going to feed her anymore. And the court said, okay. And so they stopped feeding her, and she starved to death. Now, the other thing is that some people in a coma who have come out of it have reported that they were aware of conversations. They knew what was going on, that they just felt trapped in this body, and yet the EEG said they were brain dead. So again, really complicated. Now, the Harvard definition is more conservative. Some people want to define death as the brain is not functioning, even if the body is functioning, the brain's not functioning, so therefore that person's dead. So Terry Schiavo, before she starved to death, would have legally been considered a dead person because her brain was not working, even though her body was. I don't think most people are comfortable with that definition, so I don't know if it will ever catch on, but that has been proposed. Now, legally, another big issue is euthanasia. So this is either passive euthanasia, like what happened with Terry Schiavo. So you just stop feeding her and then she dies, okay, euthanasia. Active euthanasia is, like, let's say you give the person an overdose of morphine. That would be active euthanasia. You are doing something in order to kill that person. And then there's physician-assisted suicide. Those are all forms of euthanasia. Some are much more legal than others. Passive euthanasia is legal for the most part. There's complicated laws, so if you're planning on passively euthanizing somebody, please look them up. But most people support that. Most physicians support passive euthanasia. Most individuals in our country support that. So this would be like do not resuscitate. So the person has stopped breathing, and we're not going to put them onto a ventilator. We're just going to let them pass away. So that's passive euthanasia. Oregon is the first state that has made physician-assisted suicide legal. And that obviously is a hugely controversial topic. If you are a minority, you tend, on average, as a generality, minorities don't support euthanasia as much as the majority group. That might be because minorities tend to trust the medical establishment less. Could also be because of religious factors and so on. It's just an interesting thing. But active euthanasia is considered murder in most states, so don't do that. But it is something that's done behind the scenes. I saw a documentary where they interviewed physicians, and many physicians said yes, they have done active euthanasia. They gave somebody an overdose of morphine illegally because the person was suffering or whatever. So, all right. So that is euthanasia. I think I talked about that enough. So we have the social meaning of death. So what does death mean to us? And this is different in each society. So for instance, if you are Christian, then you believe, if the person was Christian, that they're going to go to heaven. It'll be a much better place. It'll be wonderful. So even though we're sad that we lost them here, we're happy for them, the fact that they have now gone to heaven, and it gives us comfort to know that one day we will be reunited. If you are a member of the, what was that cult called? The Heaven's Gate cult, then you believe that death simply transfers your body into a different realm so that you can travel to Jesus on his spaceship that is traveling in the tail of the Halley's Comet. Okay, so you commit suicide in order to get there. So your religion, also your culture, race, well, race goes along with culture. It's more culture than race, that's the issue. Those all influence your view of death. If you are not religious and you don't have any positive cultural beliefs about death, then death may be an absolute horrible thing to you. It's a tragedy. It's pointless. It's senseless. It obviously proves the world is evil or whatever. So your outlook on death is going to significantly affect how you handle death when it happens, and it happens to everybody. Now, in modern America, we tend to be very distanced from death. We don't see a lot of death. You go back a century or two ago in America, and people died in the home. Today, the majority of Americans die in the hospital. So a lot of people have never experienced death in their life. And of course, the lifespan has increased, medical care has increased, so people die less often than they used to. Infants die significantly less often than they used to, so we don't see a lot of death. Also, most people used to live on a farm. A century ago, like 90% of the population lived on a farm. I live on a farm. You see a lot of births and a lot of deaths. It all happens together. So it's not as alien to you when you've grown up, even if it's just an animal. It makes more sense when it happens to a human. It's not as shocking. So we have just become really distant from death. And I think that makes it harder for us to handle death when it happens. So in America, we generally view death as like it's a medical failure. Like, the medical system should have been able to save this person, should have kept them alive. Sure, they have stage 4 kidney cancer, but why can't we fix that? And of course, there's some truth to it, because we have been able to fix so many problems. But I think the success of the medical industry has also made us view death as something that shouldn't happen, when it actually is just a normal part of existence. Like, everybody dies, except I guess there's some exceptions. Elijah, right, went up in the chariot to heaven. He didn't end up dying. So more traditional societies that are closer to nature, that experience death, that don't hospitalize dying people, they view this as just a natural part of life. which helps to decrease the negative emotions associated with death. Not that they're not there at all. I mean, obviously, if you cared about this person, you're going to be sad that they're not there. But tends not to be as overwhelmingly painful as it often is for us in modern life. Now, how we grieve depends a lot based on the culture. How we die, how we celebrate or are sad over the death of this person. You'd be surprised that how you die is also culturally dependent. So obviously in America, we're much more likely to die in a hospital, surrounded by strangers who are doing stuff to us to try to save us. If you lived in ancient Germany, you might be stabbed to death once you got too old. If you were an ancient Viking, you might jump off a cliff or be thrown off of a cliff. Although that one, there's some argument that that's not true, that didn't actually happen. But the people being stabbed to death, that was true. They'd build a pile of wood, a pyre, and then they'd put the old people onto it, and they'd stab them and then light it on fire. Eskimos used to, this wasn't a common practice, but in famine, Eskimos would put old people out onto an ice floe, and they'd float away into the ocean and die out there. In India, this is still practiced today. They will give their old people a bunch of coconut milk to drink, and that causes renal failure if you drink too much, especially if you're older and your kidneys probably already are not functioning great. And then they'll go into seizures and everything and end up dying within a day or two. So these are things that have actually happened. So how we die really depends on our culture, and how we react to that death depends on culture. So there are funeral practices that are like so crazily different. So like mainstream American funeral, we wear black, we go and we see the casket, we have a little, some speeches are given to remember the person, and then we go back to like maybe the oldest daughter's home or the son's home, and we have some food and drinks and talk about the person and whatever, rub shoulders, and then it's done. And then we expect people to move on past it pretty quickly. Now, there are other cultures, and I will post some of these videos for you to watch. So you go down to New Orleans, and you have a black funeral down in New Orleans, and it is like, it's a party. They hire a band, and there's dancers. Now, on the way to the cemetery, it's very, like, melancholy, and, like, we're sad this person's dead. And then on the way back, now it's party time. So it's like Mardi Gras, which is the kind of funeral I would like to have. If you go to Tibet, you have sky funerals where you take the person's dead body up to a mountain, you cut them into little pieces, and then you toss them to the vultures. That's called a sky burial. So how death happens, both the process of dying and post-dying, the death part of it, is very culturally dependent. Some cultures are very happy about death, like for instance, with Christian beliefs, right? Not that you're happy the person died, but you're happy that they've gone on to a better place. Other cultures, like you're supposed to be sad and upset. So like Puerto Ricans tend to be very emotionally expressive with their funerals. Jewish and a lot of Middle Eastern funerals. Some of them you'll even hire people to cry and weep, and obviously the more loved this person was, the more upset people will be, so you hire people to be upset to make sure everybody knows how loved that person was. Sorry, I have to sneeze. Oh, this cold is terrible. You're lucky I'm not teaching this class on campus and you can catch it from me. Versus like a Japanese funeral, like if your husband died, then you as the wife would want to smile the whole time because you don't want to burden other people with your pain. So our cultural and ethnic practices are going to really influence how death happens. Now, life expectancy is also influencing our psychology of death because people used to live shorter lifespans. The lifespan has increased. It wasn't as short as people make it out to be, like, oh, the average lifespan was like 30 years old. That's true, but that's if you're including infant mortality. So if you made it past like 15, then you had a good chance of living to your 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe even 100. It was possible. The chances of living to 15 was pretty low. And so that really brought the average life expectancy down. Nowadays, it's very typical for our babies and especially our children and teenagers to make it past those ages. So the life expectancy has gone up. Also, however, the average age at death has also gone up. So the average life expectancy versus the expected age at death are really the statistics that you want to be looking at. What is the expected age of death? So nowadays we expect people to get to 76 and a half years old on average. Now, if you break that down by gender and race, you see differences. Females live longer than males. Whites live longer than blacks by about roughly 5 years. You see with the ancient Rome part, this is the average life expectancy. But if you looked at people who actually made it into old age, there are many people who were very old, and it wasn't unusual for people to be in their 60s, 70s, 80s. All right, so these are the leading causes of death. So if you're under 1 year old, it's usually a genetic issue that causes you to die. Low birth weight or short gestation is number 2. Sudden infant death syndrome, number 3. The rest of childhood is mostly unintentional injuries. Interestingly, for 15 to 24-year-olds, the second cause of death is homicide. The third is suicide, which is terrible. The older you get, it starts getting cancer and heart disease, which isn't really surprising because your body is, you weren't taking care of your body very well. How many of you eat too much junk food? And so that's all going to start breaking things down. This is life expectancy at birth, based on the time period as well as the place in the world. So as time has gone by, this is what I was saying before, infants do better, and you're more likely to live for longer. So although this past generation of kids is the first generation in the history of our country that is expected to have a shorter life expectancy than their parents. Every generation has lived longer than the previous generation, but now this generation, not eating well, GMOs and pesticides and all these toxins in the environment, food doesn't have as much vitamin and mineral content as before, so even if you are eating your vegetables, you're not getting as much nutrition as your grandparents were. So yeah, sorry about that. Okay, so why do we die? That's an interesting question. What kills us, and why? Why do we age? Why do we die? So one theory is that we are programmed, that there's a maximum lifespan for every creature on the planet. So humans, the maximum lifespan is 120 years. If you're a Christian, the Bible, there used to not be a maximum lifespan, so people live for hundreds and hundreds of years, and then one day God said that the limit will be 120 because somebody made him mad. Make God mad and bad things happen. So now, one theory I've also heard is that the atmosphere changed, and so there's something about the chemical content of the atmosphere that you see down here. We have the damage theory, that there were not as many free radicals. There's not as much. There's not as many chemicals that reacted with our body in a bad way to increase aging. And then the atmosphere for some reason changed. I can't remember what theory is. You can look it up. But it's an interesting theory. And that increased the speed of aging and made us die at an earlier age. Now the Hayflick limit is another idea of, or maybe an explanation, I should say, of the programmed theories. The Hayflick limit says, I think it was after the guy who came up with this theory, the name Hayflick, that cells can only divide a certain amount of time, and that's species specific. We know that some, like a mouse, their cells can reproduce like 14 times. A tortoise can reproduce like up to 120 times, or divide, I should say. and humans can only divide like 10 times. So we, you talk about producing new cells and so on. So how many times can you produce new cells before it doesn't work anymore? And that's when we start getting damage to the body. Now, obviously, that also depends on the type of cell that we're talking about. Like our skin cells reproduce more often than some other cells, but yeah, it's an interesting theory. Another theory may be that our telomeres, how long they are, will determine how long we live. So the telomeres are the caps at the end of your DNA spiral. They have to end at some point. And there's actually little caps on the tops and bottoms of your DNA helix. The more stressed out you are, the worse your nutrition and so on. All the bad things we can do if you smoke, if you have a hostile personality, those all shorten your telomeres. And eventually the DNA starts to unravel, and when your DNA unravels, it seems to cause aging and death. So that's another interesting theory. And then free radicals, basically it's the idea that we have, our body uses oxygen. Oxygen causes oxidation. So like when iron comes in contact with oxygen, it rusts. When an apple comes in contact with oxygen, it browns. So our body also oxidizes in a sense. It's like if your cholesterol oxidizes, then it gets stuck under the lining of your blood vessels and you start to get a buildup and eventually a heart attack. Now, if you eat well, then that brings in a lot of electrons. So basically, I'm trying to think how to explain this quickly, and it's going slowly instead. So you have the electrons, and your cells will take, if they become unbalanced, they'll grab another electron off of another cell in order to balance. And it keeps doing that through the body, and every time it steals an electron, it causes damage. So if you eat something with antioxidants in it, then that will help to bring in these extra electrons in order to balance things quickly so that you don't have to keep stealing these electrons. And then you stop the oxidation of your body. So Kubler-Ross was a woman born in Switzerland, if I remember right. I'm pretty sure it was Switzerland. She was one of a set of triplets, which is kind of interesting. And she studied dying. She's the most famous person for helping us to understand the process of dying. And she came up with these stages of death. So you have denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, these 5 stages. And she said everybody goes through these stages. Some people, you see the criticisms there, death is not a stage-like process. There's individual differences. The course of the illness is going to affect it. I personally think that she did agree with all of those, so I'm not sure that they're actual criticisms. Like for instance, when she got older, she had a stroke. She said she skipped denial and went straight to anger. So I do think that she recognized that it's not like an exact science, but just that these are normal parts of dealing with death and really dealing with any trauma or loss. So denial and isolation is often included with that. So it can't believe this is happening. You have a really hard time believing that it could possibly be true. Anger, that is often like, why me? You might be angry at doctors, friends, family, maybe angry at God that this is happening to you. And then bargaining, like, please God, just take this away and I'll be a good person for the rest of my life. Depression, so finally you accept it, you believe that it's not going to change, and now you just, like, all this loss is really, like, it's gotten to you, it's difficult. And then accepting the inevitability of this, that this is going to happen, that this is okay, and you have a calmness and a peacefulness about it. which Kubler-Ross said that's really what you want to be in when it comes to acceptance. So yeah, I think it's a great theory because it helps us to understand what people go through, what we may go through, what we will go through at some point. And that if somebody's angry about their death or they're in denial, that we shouldn't be angry at them for feeling this way. It's a normal part of dying, or like I said, any big trauma. So bereavement is basically, we have now lost somebody. Okay, so this is obvious. I was going to say this is obviously the person who's survived somebody's death, but that's not necessarily true. If you're dying, you can be bereaved too. You have lost, you've lost your life. You've lost maybe ability to function and so on. So you can go through a bereavement and you can be in grieving without being, somebody dying yet. I have to sneeze again. Sorry. I hate when I need to sneeze and I can't sneeze. So grieving is the emotional expression of grief. You can have, like I said, anticipatory grief where you're going to lose something, including your own life. And so you're anticipating that and you're already sad and bereaved. Mourning is the culturally approved reaction. So how do you react when you are grieving? What's the appropriate way to react? And some people react appropriately and some don't. Now, if you don't react appropriately, if you don't mourn, according to your culture, that could cause some serious problems for you. So take, what was that girl's name? The lady who her 2-year-old disappeared and was murdered, found duct taped in trash bags in a swamp or something. And her reaction to losing her child was going out and partying, which is obviously not culturally approved in our culture, probably not most cultures. So a lot of people have said she must be guilty of murdering her own daughter because she reacted that way. Which, I don't know, there's some truth to it, but some people do react poorly. They react in a countercultural way. And obviously, in her case, it got her accused of murder, although she got off for it. So Bowlby, Parkson Bowlby, Bowlby's the big name that you always need to know in attachment. He conceptualized grieving as a part of attachment. So you have been separated from a loved one, somebody who has brought you closeness, somebody who has brought you security over the years, and it's difficult to be separated from them. Now, you can also be insecurely attached, so just because this person was not wonderful does not mean you don't have an attachment to them. And now that that attachment has been broken, it's difficult to deal with. So he said there could be numbness, there could be yearning, you have these waves of grief, uncontrollable weeping, these separation anxiety basically is what he would say. And then also despair. So that's sort of like if you look at Kubler-Ross's depression, maybe you've gotten to the point of depression. But he didn't really say these happen in clear-cut stages. They just happen, they come and go in waves. But I think it does correlate fairly well with Kubler-Ross's. So, numbness could be denial, yearning, maybe bargaining, and despair, depression. And then he said you finally get to reorganization. So you start to put less energy into grieving and more energy into what do I do with my life now. Now, one of the things in our society that we do is we tell people to get over it. They should be over the death of this person. Why are you still upset by this? Why do you keep going to the graveyard? I believe that grieving is a 5-year process. The first year, you are just a mess. And you feel like there's nothing, it'll never get better. After that, the second year, you're still a mess, but you start seeing glimpses of light at the end of the tunnel. You're not crying all the time anymore. Things are starting to calm down. Third year, it's even more like you're happy and moving on with your life more often than you are falling apart. By the fourth year, you're doing pretty good, and you only have spells of being upset. And the 5th year is, I believe, you get into reorganization. I've now dealt with my grief, and now how am I going to put this grief into who I am and come out a new person? What am I going to do with my life from here on out? And I think it's important to realize that grieving is not like a 1-week process or a 1 month or 6-month process. It's a years-long process. And we often push people like, gosh, it's been a month. Why are you still crying over this? And you might think, I can't believe people would say that, but it happens. People say it all the time. You go to a funeral and somebody's just saying, well, they're in a better place. You should just be happy for them. Well, you can't be happy when you're grieving. And why would you be happy that you've lost a person? It doesn't even make sense to be happy. Sure, yeah, I'm happy they're in a better place, but I'm not happy they left me. And that's sort of what Bowlby says, that it is normal for us to have this yearning, to have this despair, to have this separation anxiety from this person. So whether you're happy for them or not, you can still be sad for yourself, and it takes a while to get through that. So don't push people through grief too fast. Because if you do push them through grief too fast, they don't reorganize, and they're never able to move on properly. So people need to talk about it. They need to, as many times as they want to bring up this person who's died, they need to bring up the person who's died. It's normal. Now, one model is the dual process model of bereavement. And this, you've got the Kubler-Ross, you have the Parks-Bowlby model. The dual process model says that grief is even more messy and more individualized than even Bowlby said. So you're going back and forth between coping well with it and then dealing with the emotional blow. Now you've got this, the grief and the pain and the sadness. So you're doing okay coping, you're not doing okay. And it's just this back and forth, constantly oscillating between the two. And that's normal, right? That's what I was saying before, that sort of thing is normal. And the more you deal with it, the less often you go between the two. The more often you're in coping, the less often you go to completely falling apart. But even a year down the line, 3 years down the line, it's pretty normal to still have moments when you fall apart, especially a year down the line. So don't blame people and don't blame yourself if you're still having fall apart times. So just some terms here. Less oriented coping is you're dealing with your emotions and reconciling to, loss oriented coping. I said less. Loss oriented coping. You're dealing with the emotionality. You're reconciling yourself to the loss. Restoration coping is focusing on your daily living and reorganization and your new roles in life and whatever. Okay, so dealing directly with the loss or just dealing with all of the daily challenges of living. And that's what a lot of people try to do so they don't have to do the loss-oriented coping. So your parent dies or your spouse dies and you decide you're going to stay in school and you're going to take extra classes for the semester and work harder because you don't want to think about it. There's nothing wrong with doing some restoration coping. There's nothing wrong with filling your life with just daily challenges so that you don't have to think about it. But you also need to be doing loss-oriented coping. So if you are living so hard that you never have to think about this loss, then you're doing yourself a disservice. You're not going to heal and get over it fast. Or not fast, get over it, period. And by the way, the longer you grieve, the more you focus on restoration coping. Okay, so that's pretty normal.